candidate we have this week is targeting a director of marketing role, and they're targeting this role at a big tech company, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, those kinds of companies. The leadership principle at work here is dive deep. And the question that was asked was, walk me through a big problem or issue in your organization that you helped solve. Now, the you helped solve, that's kind of a delivers results hint, but the big problem, big issue, I want to understand as an interviewer how you solve the problem. That's where the dive deep part comes into this. It's how did you solve the problem? Throughout this interview, there's going to be a couple of things that I want you to be on the lookout for. It's going to help you learn and understand kind of getting to that next level. Because the important thing to understand about this candidate is they're not currently a director of marketing. They're reaching up. They're hoping for a promo by switching companies. So things to look out for in this answer that will come up as themes throughout the interview. One, structure of their answers, right? Generally, star format, that's your winner. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to walk me, the interviewer, through a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? There was a normal, something happened, a new normal, right? A change occurred due to actions that you took. How did you get there? What are the details, right? So what is the structure of the answer? Two, what is the length of your answer? And that's kind of a proxy for how good of a communicator are you? Do you have the ability to highlight what's important and kind of remove all of the extraneous backstory stuff that in your mind may seem important, but for me as the interviewer, I don't need to be an expert at your job to assess whether or not you're very good at your job. And three, bridge questions. Bridge questions are a great way to re-engage the interviewer and create more of a conversational tone, because at the end of the day, like a big win for you as the as a candidate is to create a conversation-like environment and not an interrogation-like environment. Incidentally, you ever look in the mirror and you see that you're getting your dad's hairline and you're not really sure how you feel about that because you're getting old? Well, anyways, one of our core missions here at Interview At is to help 100,000 people land their dream jobs. And the way that we're doing that is through things like this. The YouTube channel where we publish mock interviews with analysis. We have a content library that you can buy. It's available for sale at interviewout.com. We have mock interviews, both free and VIP, that you can sign up for to prepare yourself for an interview. We continue to add software. GuessTheLP.com. It's a great guessing game that was created. You can go, it just goes through our question database of what is the leadership principle at work. We continue to iterate. I'd love to hear from you. If there's things that you need as a customer, let me know in the comments. Put it down below. All right, first question. And for this one, I want you to walk me through a big problem or an issue that you've had in your organization, past organization, that you helped to solve. But for the purposes of this question, I want you to kind of think like bigger is better, as in bigger problem is better, as well as the more active role you played in helping solve the problem, the better.
Sure. So actually in my first role, I was brought in to be the product marketing manager for advanced threat protection. At the time.
Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of beeps in this video, and hopefully everyone understands why I do this. I blur out the videos to kind of protect the candidates. I design the product that I would want if I was gonna participate as a candidate. So I blur out the faces, I do the best I can. I've tried messing with the audio to obscure the person's voice, and it just never really works out well, especially with people with accents and things of that nature. But I do make my best efforts to get names of companies, and where it matters, names of products bleeped out of the video. And in this particular video, this candidate he shared a lot.
The product wasn't doing very well. It had been in market for about a month. And typically when I start any role, I sort of get a lay of the land. So I basically spent my first month sort of interviewing different stakeholders, people in sales, people on the product team, and then also a lot of our customers. Because one of the things I was noticing is that there were a lot of customer escalations on product issues. So I used to meet with a lot of customers, chat with a lot of customers about what was going on with the product. After sort of understanding the lay of the land, what I sort of saw was that there's a huge gap in understanding between the customer's perception of how the product was doing and the product team's perception of how the product should be behaving. And in the middle, the sales teams were very, very agitated with the product team. They felt like the product team wasn't invested in the product, wasn't helping them sell the product. And if a sales team doesn't want to talk about your product or sell your product, it doesn't matter how good that product is. It's not going to move.
So I'm sorry, the sales team objected to what about the product team?
The sales team felt like the product team never leaned in on any of the product issues that they were escalating. They didn't feel like the product team seemed like they were invested in trying to grow the perception with the customers. And so when I took a step back after that sort of month of review, what I noticed was it seems like there was a big disconnect in perception of what the product can do and what the product experience is for the customers. One of the ways that I felt like we could fill that gap was to actually have a programmatic approach where we had product get closer and lean in with the sales team and also get closer to the customers. Most of the time, the product team had any types of customer interactions. It was fairly ad hoc because this was a brand new product. It was just ad hoc escalations. There was nothing programmatic. And so after sort of chatting with my manager and chatting with sales as well as the product team, I came up with something called a white glove program for advanced threat protection. It was going to be a programmatic approach to help the product team get closer to the customer, build its relationship with sales because they would lean in on specific customer interactions, and then also sort of change that perception gap where with the sales team, where the sales team felt like, okay, the product team is definitely helping us leaning into these sales. And then also changing that perception with customers where they felt like, okay, product team is getting involved. They see that we're having some issues and they want to actually help us. So the programmatic approach that I came up with this white glove program was that the sales teams would be able to nominate customers that fit certain requirements. And those requirements were 10,000 seats. They had already been involved in having a security conversation, and they already were using some Microsoft products, and they were using Exchange Online Protection. So those were the core criteria. And then with the product team, I had buy-in from their lead, the product lead, that they would actually jump on a call with a customer every 2 weeks to talk about how the customer was evolving and checking out the trial of the product. And so basically what would happen is sales teams would nominate a customer. And then I also worked with a vendor who I hired who was actually going to help manage like some of the operations of the program. And basically, yeah, did you have a question? Sorry.
No.
Oh, okay. And basically what we did was we had nominations from the field. We vetted those nominations to make sure they fit those criteria that I just spoke about. And once that happened, I did a kickoff call with my vendor colleague, with the customer and that sales team. And what we were able to do was establish whether that customer seemed like a good candidate for this program. Once that was done, then we did a kickoff call with the product team and that customer and also the sales teams. This allowed, once again, sales to get closer to product because now they felt like the product team was leaning in on some of these opportunities. And then obviously when you have word of mouth directly from the product team with the customer, it's a lot deeper engagement. It does a lot more to gain favorability. It makes it a much closer relationship. And so we launched this white glove program and it actually became a massive success. During the time of this program, we had 35 customers that actually joined. The program went for about 18 months. We had 35 customers who were included in the program. 31 of them became paying customers. Over that time of that 18 months, this program alone gained us 700,000 paid seats. The other important thing it did is it changed that reputational perception between product and sales, where sales was now like, okay, the product team is very engaged. They're really stepping up. And that made the sales teams much more effective in talking about the product with customers because they knew that the product team could lean in and help if needed. And they also had me as a PMM who would jump on calls whenever needed. And also there were two things that were very important is that this allowed the product team to get more strategic about which features they would launch because we were getting direct feedback from those customers saying, hey, we actually want you to work on native link rendering and dealing with phish false negatives more than say some other feature. And so this allowed them to prioritize between like what is P0 and P1. And we were getting direct customer word of mouth from the customer. So we helped the product team prioritize which features to launch and which features to look into first. And like I said, this also helped us gain some customer logos. Typically in cybersecurity, no customer wants to talk about what their security product they're using because they don't want hackers to have to know. However, what we were able to do is we were able to get these customers to actually join us on some other customer calls saying like, hey, we are using products. So this actually enabled us to actually gain that pipeline of customers who would be sort of MVPs for us on other customer engagements. Now, this was a programmatic approach that worked. And overall, in that 18 months that I managed Office ATP, we went from about 4 million seats to 28 million seats in that time. So it was a 700% increase in paid seats. And so it was a very successful initiative. So I'll pause there. If you have any further questions, that was one of my first forays in product marketing.
So just okay. There is a lot to unpack here, and what I want to say up front that I don't want to get lost in all of this is this was actually a really good answer. It's actually a really, really good answer with some caveats. It's important to frame this with the context that this, as we stated earlier, this candidate is targeting a director of marketing role in big tech. Okay, that carries with it a certain understanding of roles and responsibilities. And in talking through this answer, this very much feels like a missionary problem solve, right? Where he was a team of one. Eventually he had a vendor. We'll talk about that in a second. But he was a team of one kind of handling, a somewhat big-ish problem, but about what you'd expect for someone who is kind of, kind of mid-career, early mid-career, in the Amazon parlance, kind of like a high L6, right? Kind of knocking on the door of an L7 if you're familiar with Microsoft levels, probably an L64, probably not a director yet. So just in how they're talking about it and the size of the problem, the way they're scoping it and kind of the effort level. So from all that, they're reaching now for a director of marketing role. And this is the example they chose to use. Another piece of information which you wouldn't have because these videos tend to be broken up is that this was the first answer to the first question asked in our time together where we did our mock interview. And so there is no, as an interviewer, I don't have additional context. I have your resume, which has been provided to me, maybe your LinkedIn, but that's all I've got. So I can only go off what you've told me. And this is the very first deep dive into something that this candidate wants to talk about. So the challenge here then becomes, are they reaching too high, right? Is the story that they're sharing with me going to convince me that they can do this other job that they are now applying for? And is there, can I squint and see, oh yeah, I see how that story would help me understand that they can do this job. There's enough here that says good process, executes well, delivers results. All of these are good indicators for this candidate. But the way that the candidate went about solving the problem, again, felt very missionary in its style, meaning a team of one, eventually hired a vendor to help execute the program, which it kind of brings or begs the question, why wasn't this person running a team? Why didn't they have people they can delegate to? That as an interviewer raises questions in my mind as to, okay, are you ready for that next step, right? Because typically if you're director of marketing, you're not a team of one, right? You're managing, at a minimum, you're managing a team of kind of call it, 2 to 4 to 5, 6 people, likely more than case, especially in big tech, you're managing managers, right? So there's kind of a disconnect here with this being the first story straight out of the gate, this person reaching for a director of marketing role, et cetera. So all of that is to say, that there are some concerns there as to scale of opportunities, scale of size. Another point, this candidate uses superlatives in a few places, and it's generally something you want to avoid. You want the stats, the data, the measurements, which he used to great effect to speak for themselves. However, he speaks about them in absolute terms, right? Talked about adding 700,000 paid seats. Okay, against a target of what? How much of an increase was that year over year? There's nothing there that helps me bridge the gap to his statement that it was a massive success. Those are his words. He then talks about over 18 months netting from 4 million seats to 28 million seats. Well, okay, but are those the 700,000 were paid seats that belong to the initial 35 or 31 to 35 customers, or this is total, or these paid seats or not? So it's a good use of data, but he's just not connecting all the dots for me that helps me as a senior leader process, okay, this person can run a bunch of marketing programs, definitely ready to be a director of marketing. To disambiguate a couple of stats you used, just so I understand, you talked about this this program netted 700K paid seats, but then you also talked about the app going from sorry, I'm about to sneeze. The app going from 4 million to 28 million seats, but you're not attributing that to this program. That's just a different outcome.
What I'm saying is overall the business itself took off in that time, but this program directly led to 700,000 seats.
That's fine. I always find it interesting when I do these videos and I rewatch, because I'm basically doing this in real time, how consistent, which I guess is a good thing, how consistent I am in terms of kind of poking at different details within the answer to kind of get the candidate to provide more clarity. I wanted to make sure I understood the two, how they related to it, which is fine. So I guess my first question is, you talked a little bit about, you spent your first month talking to people, fine, but that's a bit broad. What first tipped you off to the nature of this problem? Okay, so the what tipped you off question, right? The candidate gave a very long answer. Structure-wise, probably spoke a bit long, didn't really provide a lot of on-ramps for conversation for me as the interviewer, but we'll kind of ignore that for right now. There just wasn't enough details here as to how did this surface? How did you know this was a problem? How did you scope it? Like, how do you determine that this is a thing that requires your energy and effort, that requires company resources to go solve? That needs to be part of the kind of situation and task part of your answer.
So basically, the thing that tipped me off was when I first chatted with product, they would tell me, hey, Office ATP is doing great. Office ATP has all these capabilities. We don't see why anyone would have any problems. Meanwhile, on my first day at example, I got 3 escalations from customers saying, hey, this isn't catching anything. This is like this product doesn't work. We don't understand. And typically, if you're in product marketing, you're sort of like that glue that stitches across multiple organizations. I hadn't seen this kind of a disconnect between like what the product team is saying should be happening versus what the customers are saying should be happening. The other thing that was very important is that when I talked to sales, they were also saying like, hey, this product is like crap. Like it doesn't work. We don't even like talking about it. And they basically would say, hey, we don't think the product team is leaning in. We don't think the product team really engages with us. They don't respond to emails in time. And so those like initial conversations I had sort of tipped me off that, hey, there's a huge gap between even our internal teams. Like sales doesn't like this product team. That has to change if this product is going to sell. And also what the customer is saying is completely a 180 from what the product team is saying. That to me also didn't make any sense. So my goal was, how can I actually close that gap and do that in a way where it actually could be effective and maybe programmatic?
So being a more senior leader in an organization means you've developed your frameworks and your processes for repeatable and continued successful results. The listening channels that this candidate speaks to, he identifies them clearly. Okay, talk to your internal sales teams, talk to your customers, etc. But he's not really talking to details of how this kind of bubbled up. Remember, the question was, how did this first get tipped off as a problem? And so what I'm looking for, what I would have liked to have seen more, for someone who's reaching higher than where they're currently at in their org, I would like to see a better description and details around their listening channels and how that information is getting processed and prioritized, rather than what felt like slightly kind of anecdotal and potentially reactionary in terms of kind of this is the problem that's in front of me versus here's the set of problems I have and here's how I decided this was the most important one. It's just something to think about. It's not entirely clear that's the case here, but it is kind of a thing running in the back of my mind as I am listening to this candidate work through his answers.
Okay, but so the data, as it were, that you were using were the escalations, basically.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And so as you work through, right, because the initial data set being escalations, that's fine, but escalations are, as just generally a very blunt instrument, right? So
right.
As those escalations raised this in your mind as it might be an issue, what gaps did you discover in the kind of general understanding end to end of the customer life cycle that you had to fill in? Like that even the sales team didn't know and the product team did know, or the product team didn't know and the sales team didn't know, or both teams didn't know. But like there has to have been some sort of gap that neither side saw that needed to be filled, that you ultimately had to fill the gap on. Otherwise you wouldn't have been able to get the two sides together. So what did you
let me
So the reason that I, as the interviewer, asked that specific question that specific way is, again, the level of detail provided from this candidate in terms of the how. It's a bit light. There's a lot of content in this answer, a lot to love, but it's missing some of the kind of table stakes that I would expect for a more senior level candidate, somebody who's targeting a director of marketing role. It's just lacking some of those core details of someone who has experience running broad programs over time across an organization, et cetera. And I'm really trying to get at, okay, but tell me how. Tell me how you prioritize. Tell me how you get the data. Just tell me, give me more details.
Figure out.
Let me make sure I understand the question. So you're asking, what did I initially see to sort of know that there was the problem, which I sort of talked about, and then how did I fill that gap between
Yeah, no, I didn't ask it very cleanly, and that's a fair point. It's more escalations by in and of themselves are not sufficient, or clearly had not been sufficient to be the connective tissue here. So how did you fill the gaps to get everybody internally, not externally, internally on the same page?
I see. Okay.
Like what additional data were you using?
Yeah. So once again, I think the initial data that I used was really these conversations. So one is the escalation that I received. The other was that so basically what I did was I have like a weekly sort of office hours with the sales teams. And what I would do is I would actually meet with them every week to talk about, hey, how are things going with the product? How is performing out with customers? How do you guys like approach the sale? And so one of the things that I also learned through this time is that, like I said, the sales team felt like there was also not enough information available in how to sort of talk about some of these gaps and these escalations that they were getting from the customers. They felt like there was a disconnect between basically this disconnect between the product team and the sales team, where they didn't feel like product was leaning in. They didn't feel like they had enough information and collateral. And actually, one of the outcomes of this program also was because of these conversations where they felt like there was a gap in the product, they didn't have enough data. One of the things I also was able to do, this is different from just the program, I actually also created an airlift for the sales teams within the first 6 months. And so this was basically, typically we also have like, obviously has their trainings. Because the sales team felt like there was a gap and there was not enough information and they didn't have enough understanding, we did a special airlift where we actually had our TSPs fly into Redmond, and we actually had about 3,000 TSPs join in on Teams, where I got buy-in from the product team that they would actually have a technical session on talking about how the product works, so that the sales teams could actually be equipped with more information to have discussions with customers. So another gap that was identified from talking with the sales teams themselves was that there was not enough technical collateral, and they didn't have enough of the expertise that they felt like they needed to answer some of the questions with these customers, which also frustrated the customer because they weren't getting information quickly. So this airlift that we put together, it was received very well. We actually had 2 days in Redmond where I had the product team, each person who was a product lead talked about their part of the product. So one person talked about the sandboxing, one person talked about anti-phish, one person talked about the reporting. And we were able to package up all of these assets and provide them with the field. So that actually armed the field with more collateral that helped them understand how they could actually effectively talk about the product. One of the other things that we got from this is that as I had these conversations with the customers, one of the things we realized is that many of the customers were seeing poor effects of because they did not actually understand how to configure it. So one of the things that we learned from this, and this is once again, everything that led to this program was having these conversations. So you're asking me what kind of data. The data here was not quantitative. There are other aspects of quantitative data that I actually did look at as we started growing the business. Initially, this was qualitative data because you kind of have to funnel that data first, I think. And once you get that understanding of that data, then all those other quantitative data sets, we looked at those throughout the journey of the product. And I can talk a little bit about how we looked at that. But that was more to find out if some of these programmatic approaches, these conversations we had, and some of the things that we were doing were actually having effect. One of the things we learned from these conversations with the customers as well is that they found not working because of configuration issues. So we got this over multiple discussions with the customers. So I had all these customer escalations. I also did a lot of EBC. So these are executive briefings.
Yep. I won an EBC, in fact, an EBC award is back there somewhere.
I have two also. Yeah. Basically, I would get this all the time that, hey, we get these issues that we see with Office ATP, and all these conversations led us to learn is that a lot of these customers were actually configuring EOP incorrectly, which was actually affecting. So another thing that came out of this is we actually created an entire configuration document that we gave to our sales teams so that the sales teams could go in, the TSPs could go in and actually configure EOP for these customers so that ATP performance was better. So I'm going to pause there again because I know you had asked about the data question. Hopefully I sort of answered that. Yes, this initial month or so, it was mostly qualitative data analysis in these conversations. There was a lot of quantitative like assessment of data afterwards to sort of understand whether or not these programs and sort of the way we were creating collateral and some of the ways we were trying to help the field was working. And basically, you know, in that case, like I would look at sales numbers, I would look at usage rates, and sort of monitor those. And we would actually see whether or not some of these things were effective and whether we saw increases in these things, which was sort of our way of assessing whether or not it was being successful.
One of the key markers of a more senior leader within an organization, the more experience you have, is understanding how to communicate effectively in all directions. What do I mean by that? That means being able to communicate down to a team that you're managing, sideways to your colleagues for negotiations and rationalizations of resources, etc., and upwards in the organization. We've all been there, where you're explaining something to your boss or your boss's boss or higher up in the organization, and they go, yeah, just get me to the important stuff, right? They're busy. And as you progress through your organization, and typically it's the jump up to that director level, where you can really tell whether or not someone's going to make it based on how well they communicate up. This candidate clearly has command of his material, clearly knows what he's talking about. But this is kind of a butt sandwich, which is, that was a lot of words for a simple question that he ultimately didn't answer, right? Here's why. A lot of words. I as an interviewer, I lose the thread. Like, what's important here? What did he really do? Towards the end, he starts to get there. He talks about the qualitative measures in the first month. Great. But in the very front of his answer, he used some very clear performance metrics for the sales performance of how the team did. But he didn't relate that back to, at this point in the answer, how did those perform? Like, what were the qualitative metrics? Like, so it's kind of a disconnect of, what were you doing to identify the issue? Great, cool, qualitative data early on. But over time, what did your listening channels look like? How did you identify your problem? How did you know you were being successful? How were you going to know if there was a problem? Like, none of that was really answered in all of those words that were spoken. Clearly has great command of his material, clearly understands what he's doing, and is very good at operating at the level he's operating at. The concerns I would have as someone interviewing this candidate is, are they ready for that director step up? At this point in the interview, concerns. Would I hire this person for the role that they're doing? Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear they're very good. Now, I'd like to, other questions will get at how well they earn trust and how well they work well with others. But so far, lots of great content. But it's just not quite getting over the hump of, this person's clearly demonstrated they can perform at that level of a director of marketing. Now, one thing that this candidate has done throughout this interview, even though he's speaking for very long stretches of time, I do like the bridge questions, right? Where he's kind of getting to the end, even if he said, I'm going to pause here, then talk for another minute. But the bridge questions, remember, it is a conversation between you and the interviewer, right? You want it to be a back and forth. You don't want it to be you talking for 10 minutes and then stopping and hoping they ask you a great question, a great follow-up. Don't do that. Create conversation hook points. Create opportunities for me as the interviewer or whoever else is interviewing you to ask questions. But if you just talk, you're kind of pushing the interviewer back with all the words, pushing them out of the room, right? It's just too much process. So asking these bridge questions, saying, hey, I'm going to pause here. Did I answer this question right? That's all good. You want to create the environment of, this is what it's like to work with me. Here's why I'm awesome, and here's why you want to hire me. Versus, I mean, they talk a lot. There was a lot of words. I didn't really get to ask a lot of follow-up questions. Like those are all things that work against you. So I do like what he did here in that regard.
So what was the most valuable thing that you learned from this experience?
I think the most valuable thing I learned from this experience, which I have taken as something very important to this day, is that internal teams are actually teams that don't communicate with each other. There were often, and this is a very important thing, I don't know how this works at Meta or at Google or somewhere else, but it's so large and it's so expansive that internal teams don't really communicate. Sometimes what was obvious to me, because I'm the PMM where I know where all this information is, I would talk to a sales rep and they'd say, hey, I've never even seen this deck. I've never seen this whatever. I've never seen this collateral. And to your point, like one of the outcomes of this was actually I created the first Teams channel for cybersecurity. This was a way for all of our TSPs, all of our SSPs, these are our sellers, and all the product teams aligned to the Office ATP product. It started off with Office ATP, then it expanded to all of security. I created that Teams channel so we could always have a forum where we could communicate. Now, before that, we also had Yammer and a couple other things, but people were not really using it. Teams was something that was new and shiny at the time, and it's because of that real-time communication you can have with teams because you get the alerts right away. It was much more effective. So when I started, we initially had all of our I think they were called global black belts for Office ATP. Then it expanded to all of the TSPs. Then it expanded to all of the SSPs. I started out with 50 people on that teams thing, including like the 11 PMs who were part of Office ATP. I don't manage that teams channel anymore, but today it has 5,000 people. And I started that in 2019. And so to your point, what was one of the things I learned? I learned that communication, there's a lot of communication gaps internally. And even to this day, when I get in, like, when I started in the role, I used to get frustrated because I was like, how do you not know this? Like, this is like, it's available everywhere. And then I sort of learned over time, like, hey, like, most of our sellers are inundated with 5,000 things on a daily basis. They probably just don't know where this is. So I tried to create more effective tools, more effective channels of communication for our internal teams so that people could stay in sync and sort of know where things were, where things are. And that's always been something that I think that's been a good quality of mine throughout, because now that I've been almost 6 years, or well, 5.5 years, knowing that internal piece where, hey, like, this person actually doesn't know, not that they're incompetent or anything like that. So let me help them find the information they need. And that's actually been something that's very helpful for my career here.
There's actually two real nuggets here from this candidate that I wanted to highlight and point out because they're extremely helpful. One, the experience of working in a large organization is unique. It's not something you can fake. If you've been in startups for all of your career, and then you're going to go target Meta, Apple, Microsoft, Netflix, Google, any of these, Amazon, any of these big tech companies that have tens of thousands, over 100,000 employees, understanding that communications inside those organizations rarely works as well as you perceive it from the outside is a critical understanding, because it helps unlock your ability to function inside that organization, right? And you just can't fake it. You have to have lived it, know it, whatever. So do you have to have worked at big tech to get a job in big tech? Absolutely not. But it's certainly a helper, because it helps you be successful when you step into those organizations, to understand that communication over communication is often sometimes one of the keys to success. So that was an interesting point that the candidate brought out. The other interesting bit that the candidate brought out was this notion that people, they just don't know. They're not ignorant, right? There's a phrase I like to use all the time, which is I often try to ascribe not to malice that which I can ascribe to ignorance, right? Don't assume that people are trying to do you wrong. Don't assume that people are misbehaving or not communicating or not being effective in their roles, or whatever, any number of things, because they're bad at their jobs or because they're trying to make your life difficult. Sometimes they just lack information. And that's another key superpower, power up, helper whenever you're going, especially in the large organizations, but also in smaller organizations where people tend to have broader spans of control, more stuff that's under them. It's a little bit less clear, the lines of ownership of stuff. And sometimes people just don't know stuff. And it's important to be able to kind of get past well, maybe they just don't know. And if I help educate, I can help them do whatever they're trying to do and kind of get out of our own way. Okay, so what would I have read into the room for this candidate had I been on the hiring loop? For Dive Deep, candidate clearly has very strong command of their material. The story, as presented, made a case for a hands-on manager who was willing to dive deep into a problem space and diagnose. Candidate struggled with word economy, making it harder than necessary to parse their answers. There was a very solid process-driven framework presented to root cause the issue and well-thought-through plan to address it. Candidate presented sufficient scope and scale to support target level. You know what? It's funny. I read that now, and I don't think that's true. I don't know that the scope of this, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? So for the size of the company that the candidate's coming from, the scope that they had isn't that big. And I know 28 million seats or whatever the number was, it sounds like a lot, 28 million paying customers, but for the size of the company that the person was coming from, it really isn't, because this company can turn on millions of customers overnight with not a lot of effort. Where I struggle now, reflecting on this content and watching this interview again, I don't feel like the candidate was communicating at a high enough level, disseminating it out, and helping me as the interviewer or senior leader understand what was important versus what wasn't, how they went about setting up their listening channels versus not, getting into a process that would be kind of working over time versus a process that worked in the now, and then how were they prioritizing all the inputs that they had put in front of them. So, it's entirely possible that this can happen, right? Where you do as an interviewer, you do an interview with a candidate and you come out and you're like, yeah, that's a hire. And then you go back and you go through your notes and you start to kind of convince yourself either more so or less so. And for those of you not familiar with, how some of these bigger companies do it, they will get together in a room and discuss and have a back and forth and then vote, right? They'll vote once and, have a discussion, vote again, or sometimes they just vote at the end. But this can happen where someone like myself who might have written this down and said, hey, yeah, I support it. And then as you talk through it, hear the other feedback from the other people in the room, I can get talked out of my hire decision. And that's just something you have to know, right? The default position of me, the interviewer, is no hire, right? I want somebody in the role. Clearly, we're hiring for it's going to make my job easier, to make the whole company, everyone, we know our hair's on fire, blah, blah, blah. So we want to hire, but we also know that in putting our personal equity on the table, saying, got to hire this person. If we're wrong, woof, right? That hurts us, because if we say hire, you come in, you're bad, and then everyone looks at me, the interviewer, and is like, well, he said hire Joe, and Joe is terrible, so so it's not great for me. So if I'm going to stand in the room and advocate for you as the candidate, you got to help me get there. And this is one of those cases where I think, kind of the benefit of 4 months difference from when this mock interview happened. I look at it and go, oh, maybe not. Very, very good for level. Target level being where they're at. Yes, I would definitely bring this person on. There's a few more things I want to touch on just to understand. Operating at target level, probably very, very good at their job. Director of marketing, I would worry about scope and scale. That's having now rewatched this. That is what I would worry about.